December 18, 1972, 8:00 p.m. Hanoi time. Air raid sirens echoed across the North Vietnamese capital for the 847th time since American bombing operations began in 1965. Citizens moved toward shelters with practiced efficiency. Air defense crews at over 300 SA-2 surface-to-air missile sites around Hanoi and Haiphong powered up their radar systems and prepared to engage another tactical strike by F-4 Phantoms or F-105 Thunderchiefs. North Vietnamese air defense had shot down 110 American aircraft during 7 years of Rolling Thunder operations. The defenders were experienced, confident, and prepared for another engagement, following familiar patterns. Then radar operators detected contacts that didn't match expectations. Instead of tactical strike packages numbering 20 to 40 aircraft, radar screens showed massive formations approaching from multiple directions. The altitude readings were consistent: 50,000 feet, strategic bomber altitude. Aircraft identification confirmed North Vietnamese fears. B-52 Stratofortress heavy bombers. Not 20 or 30, but 129 aircraft in the first wave alone. The formations were targeting Hanoi itself, rail yards, communications facilities, petroleum storage, industrial areas. This wasn't tactical harassment. This was strategic bombardment designed to destroy North Vietnam's capacity to wage war. Operation Linebacker II had begun. For 11 consecutive days, American B-52 strategic bombers would strike North Vietnam's heartland in the most intensive bombing campaign of the Vietnam War. The operation would test North Vietnamese air defenses to destruction, cost the United States 15 B-52s and 93 crewmen, and ultimately force North Vietnam's leadership back to peace negotiations they had abandoned 6 months earlier. The campaign would demonstrate that strategic air power could achieve political objectives despite sophisticated defenses, if applied with sufficient determination and industrial capacity to sustain losses that would have stopped earlier operations. North Vietnamese air defense in December 1972 represented 8 years of combat experience and continuous improvement. From 1965 through 1968, during Operation Rolling Thunder, North Vietnamese forces had learned to counter American tactical air operations with increasing effectiveness. The air defense network centered on SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles, Soviet-designed weapons with engagement altitudes reaching 60,000 feet and effective range of approximately 25 miles. Over 300 SA-2 launch sites ringed Hanoi and Haiphong, creating overlapping coverage that forced American aircraft to run gauntlets of missile fire during every attack run. The SA-2 had proven deadly against tactical aircraft flying predictable routes at medium to high altitude. F-105 Thunderchiefs striking targets around Hanoi faced multiple SAM launches during each mission. F-4 Phantoms escorting strike packages maneuvered continuously to evade missiles that homed on their aircraft with radar guidance. Between 1965 and 1972, SA-2 missiles had shot down 110 American aircraft, a respectable kill rate that validated Soviet air defense doctrine and demonstrated that sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems could exact heavy tolls against modern air forces. MiG-21 fighters provided additional defense, harassing bomber formations and attempting to force defensive maneuvers that disrupted attack coordination. The MiG-21s weren't expected to shoot down large numbers of American aircraft, but their presence complicated strike planning and forced American forces to allocate escort fighters that reduced bomb tonnage reaching targets. Anti-aircraft artillery added depth to defenses with over 7,000 guns ranging from 37mm automatic weapons to 100mm heavy caliber systems positioned around critical facilities. The guns created walls of explosive shells through which attacking aircraft needed to fly, inflicting damage even when they didn't achieve direct hits. North Vietnamese air defense doctrine had been shaped by previous B-52 operations during the war. B-52s had flown arc-light missions since 1965, but those operations had targeted areas in South Vietnam or near the demilitarized zone, rarely striking heavily defended targets in North Vietnam's heartland. The few B-52 strikes against northern targets had been limited in scope and duration. North Vietnamese leadership believed that American political constraints would prevent sustained strategic bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong. The risk of losing expensive B-52 bombers over heavily defended targets seemed too high for American political leadership to accept, especially as peace negotiations appeared to be progressing towards settlement. North Vietnamese confidence rested partly on the belief that their air defense was effectively impenetrable. The halt of Rolling Thunder operations in November 1968 had been interpreted as American recognition that bombing couldn't break North Vietnamese will and cost more in aircraft and crew losses than the strategic gains justified. The SA-2 system had been optimized specifically for high-altitude bombers, precisely the threat that B-52 formations represented. Soviet military advisors present at North Vietnamese air defense sites had trained crews in radar operation, missile guidance, and tactical coordination. The collective experience suggested that sustained B-52 operations against Hanoi would result in prohibitive losses for the United States. What North Vietnamese planners hadn't fully appreciated was that the B-52 Stratofortress represented capabilities far beyond tactical strike aircraft they had experience engaging. The B-52D and B-52G variants operating in December 1972 were 8-engine strategic bombers with 185-foot wingspans and maximum loaded weights approaching 185,000 pounds. Each aircraft carried bomb loads up to 60,000 pounds. A combination of internal bay capacity and external pylons that could be configured with 500-pound and 750-pound general-purpose bombs. A single B-52 delivered more explosive tonnage than an entire squadron of tactical fighters. The B-52's operational ceiling exceeded 50,000 feet, above the optimal engagement envelope for many air defense systems and at altitudes where anti-aircraft artillery was ineffective. Cruise speed of 500 miles per hour allowed rapid transit to target areas. Unrefueled range exceeded 8,800 miles, enabling missions from bases at Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, over 2,500 miles from Hanoi, or Utapao Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand. The strategic reach meant B-52 operations weren't constrained by proximity to combat zones. Aircraft could strike from sanctuaries that North Vietnamese forces couldn't threaten. Each B-52 carried a crew of 6, pilot and co-pilot in the upper deck cockpit, navigator and radar navigator in the lower deck responsible for navigation and bombing, electronic warfare officer, managing defensive systems and tail gunner operating 4 50-caliber machine guns defending against fighter attacks. The division of responsibilities allowed sophisticated mission execution with precision bombing, using radar guidance systems that could identify and strike targets through weather and darkness that defeated visual bombing. Defensive systems on the B-52 included electronic countermeasures equipment that jammed enemy radar frequencies, chaff dispensers that scattered clouds of aluminum strips to create false targets and obscure the bomber's actual position, and the tailgun armament that provided last-ditch defense against fighter attacks. Formation tactics emphasized cells of 3 B-52s flying in close proximity, creating mutual electronic warfare support, where jamming from multiple aircraft overlapped and confused missile guidance radars. The formations could saturate defenses with simultaneous targets that overwhelmed tracking capacity. The B-52 had been developed in the 1950s as America's primary strategic nuclear bomber, the aircraft that would deliver hydrogen bombs against Soviet cities in the event of World War III. The design prioritized altitude, range, payload, and defensive systems necessary to penetrate Soviet air defenses. Adaptation to conventional bombing in Vietnam required tactical refinement but didn't fundamentally change the aircraft's capabilities. By 1972, the B-52 was a proven platform with 2 decades of operational experience. The mission to bomb Hanoi would represent the highest risk operation B-52 crews had undertaken, but the aircraft's capabilities matched the requirements. The first night of Linebacker II tested both the B-52's capabilities and North Vietnamese defenses with unprecedented intensity. On December 18th, 129 B-52 bombers struck Hanoi in 3 waves, spaced throughout the evening. Primary targets included the Yen Vian railway complex northeast of Hanoi, Hanoi radio transmitter facilities, and petroleum storage areas at Haiphong. The bombers approached at 50,000 feet in formation cells that presented North Vietnamese air defense with more simultaneous targets than they'd ever engaged during a single night. North Vietnamese SA-2 batteries responded with massive missile launches. Over 200 surface-to-air missiles were fired during the first night's attacks. More missiles than North Vietnamese forces typically expended during entire weeks of rolling thunder operations. The sheer number of launches reflected both the threat that 129 B-52s represented and the determination to inflict maximum casualties on American bomber forces. 3 B-52s were shot down during the first night. SA-2 missiles detonated close enough to damage aircraft structure and critical systems, forcing crews to abandon aircraft or attempt emergency landings in Thailand or over the Gulf of Tonkin, where rescue forces could recover survivors. The second night on December 19th brought 93 B-52s back to Hanoi. North Vietnamese missile crews, exhausted from the previous night's operations, nevertheless engaged the bomber formations with hundreds of additional SAM launches. 2 more B-52s were shot down. The cumulative losses, 5 bombers in 2 nights, raised questions about whether the campaign could be sustained. 5% losses exceeded the threshold that military doctrine considered acceptable for strategic bombing operations. If losses continued at that rate, Strategic Air Command would lose a significant portion of its B-52 force before achieving campaign objectives. American tactical planners adjusted bomber approach routes, altitudes, and timing based on analysis of the first 2 nights' operations. The initial missions had followed predictable patterns that allowed North Vietnamese air defense to position optimally. Subsequent missions varied approach directions, with bombers arriving from northeast, northwest, and directly from the south, rather than following single corridors. Altitude variations complicated SAM battery fire control solutions. Timing adjustments prevented North Vietnamese crews from predicting when formations would arrive and preparing accordingly. Nights 3 and 4 on December 20th and 21st saw approximately 60 B-52 sorties each night with continued losses, but at reduced rates. A 36-hour pause for Christmas on December 22nd and 23rd provided both sides opportunity to assess the campaign's progress. For North Vietnamese leadership, the pause demonstrated that American political constraints still influenced military operations. Traditional communist interpretation held that American public opinion limited escalation even during intensive operations. For American planners, the pause allowed reconnaissance assessment of damage inflicted and tactical refinement for subsequent missions. December 26th brought the largest single raid of Linebacker II. 120 B-52s struck Hanoi rail yards, radio stations, industrial complexes, and military facilities in coordinated attacks that arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. The tactics refined during previous missions were fully implemented. B-52 formations approached from different vectors, forcing North Vietnamese air defense to divide attention across multiple threats. Wild Weasel F-4 Phantoms, equipped with anti-radiation missiles, struck SA-2 radar sites, destroying or forcing shutdown of radars that guided missiles toward bombers. Electronic warfare aircraft jammed communications and radar frequencies. The coordinated approach overwhelmed North Vietnamese defenses in ways that previous individual strikes hadn't achieved. SA-2 batteries attempting to engage bombers from one direction found their radar systems jammed or destroyed by Wild Weasel attacks. Batteries successfully launching missiles at one formation often couldn't reload before bombers from different directions crossed their engagement zones. The complexity of defending against simultaneous multi-axis attacks exceeded North Vietnamese air defense coordination capabilities developed during years of experience against less sophisticated tactical strikes. By the 10th night of operations on December 27th, North Vietnamese SAM inventory showed critical depletion. SA-2 batteries around Hanoi launched only 68 missiles during that night's attacks, less than half the rate of earlier missions. Crucially, none of those missiles successfully intercepted B-52s. Experienced crews had been killed or injured during previous engagements. Missile stocks were exhausted faster than Soviet resupply could replace them. The tactical adaptations that American forces had implemented reduced missile effectiveness even when launches occurred. North Vietnamese air defense was approaching collapse under sustained pressure it had never been designed to withstand. The 11th and final night on December 29th saw 60 B-52s return to Hanoi with minimal resistance. North Vietnamese air defense launched few missiles. Anti-aircraft artillery fire was sporadic. The formations struck their targets and returned to base without losses. The campaign had achieved what North Vietnamese leadership had believed impossible. American forces had sustained strategic bombing operations for 11 consecutive nights, despite sophisticated air defenses adapted tactics to reduce losses and demonstrated willingness to continue operations until North Vietnam's capacity to resist was exhausted. The cumulative statistics of Linebacker II told the story of strategic airpower pushed to its limits and ultimately achieving campaign objectives. 729 B-52 sorties over 11 days had dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnamese targets. 15 B-52s were lost to enemy action, a 2% loss rate that was significant but acceptable for strategic objectives achieved. 93 crewmen were killed in action or captured. North Vietnamese forces had fired over 1,200 SA-2 missiles, exhausting stockpiles that represented years of Soviet military aid and depleting inventories faster than replacement supplies could arrive. The targets destroyed during Linebacker II crippled North Vietnam's ability to sustain military operations in the south. Hanoi's rail system was paralyzed, cutting supply lines that moved weapons and ammunition from Chinese border crossings to forward areas. Haiphong port facilities were heavily damaged and mined, preventing Soviet supply ships from offloading military equipment. Petroleum storage areas were destroyed, restricting fuel availability for trucks and military vehicles. Industrial capacity that supported war production was reduced by bombing that destroyed factories and power generation infrastructure. North Vietnamese civilian casualties from Linebacker II remained disputed. North Vietnamese government claimed over 1,600 civilians killed during the 11 days of bombing. American sources disputed those figures, arguing that precision radar bombing had minimized collateral damage and that many reported casualties resulted from North Vietnamese anti-aircraft artillery shells falling back to earth in populated areas. The actual casualty numbers remain uncertain, but the damage to North Vietnam's military infrastructure was undeniable and measurable through reconnaissance imagery and intelligence assessment. The reasons why North Vietnamese air defense couldn't stop Linebacker II, despite sophisticated equipment and 8 years of combat experience, revealed fundamental limitations in defensive doctrine and material capacity. SA-2 missiles were effective weapons when employed against limited numbers of targets following predictable routes. The system required radar guidance for missile intercept. Electronic countermeasures jamming from B-52 formations disrupted radar tracking and degraded missile effectiveness. When multiple B-52 cells approached simultaneously from different directions, each employing jamming equipment and protected by wild weasel radar suppression aircraft, SA-2 batteries faced targeting problems that exceeded their design parameters. The limited missile inventory proved critical. North Vietnamese air defense had stockpiled approximately 1,500 SA-2 missiles around Hanoi and Haiphong before Linebacker II began. Firing over 1,200 missiles during 11 days exhausted that stockpile faster than Soviet resupply could replace it. Each SA-2 launch site required 4 to 6 hours to reload missiles after firing, meaning that multiple B-52 waves during single nights could attack before batteries were ready to engage again. The industrial capacity to sustain missile production sufficient to match American sortie rates didn't exist in North Vietnam, or even in the Soviet Union, at levels that would allow indefinite defense. Anti-aircraft artillery proved ineffective against bombers at 50,000 feet. The 85mm and 100mm heavy-caliber guns that were most capable of reaching high altitude couldn't achieve effective accuracy at those ranges. Barrage fire, filling airspace with explosive shells hoping for random hits, wasted enormous ammunition stocks without achieving significant results. The psychological effect of massive anti-aircraft fire was real, but actual damage inflicted was minimal compared to ammunition expended. MiG-21 fighters attempted bomber intercepts during several nights of Linebacker II, but achieved limited success. B-52 tail gunners shot down 2 MiG-21s during the campaign, kills that deterred subsequent aggressive pursuit. The tail guns' 450 caliber machine guns weren't powerful anti-aircraft weapons, but at night against pilots attempting rear-quarter attacks on large, slow targets, they proved adequate for defense. Most MiG-21 pilots broke off attacks when B-52 tail gunners engaged, unwilling to press attacks that might result in their own destruction. B-52 formation tactics exploited mutual support concepts where individual aircraft in 3-plane cells provided overlapping electronic warfare coverage. The jamming from 3 B-52s flying close formation created electromagnetic interference that confused SA-2 guidance radars attempting to track individual aircraft. Missiles launched at the formations often lost guidance lock and either self-destructed or flew ballistically without hitting targets. The tactic was foolproof. 15 B-52s were shot down, proving missiles could penetrate jamming, but it significantly reduced missile effectiveness below what individual bombers operating alone would have experienced. American tactical adaptation after the first night's heavy losses demonstrated organizational flexibility that North Vietnamese forces couldn't match. Analysis of shootdowns revealed that predictable approach routes and timing allowed North Vietnamese air defense to concentrate forces optimally. Varying approach directions forced North Vietnamese air defense to defend multiple axes simultaneously. Altitude variations complicated fire control solutions. Timing unpredictability prevented North Vietnamese crews from predicting when targets would appear and preparing accordingly. These adaptations, combined with wild weasel radar suppression and electronic warfare improvements, reduced B-52 losses dramatically. The final night saw 0 losses despite continued operations over the same heavily defended targets. North Vietnamese dependence on Soviet resupply created strategic vulnerability that American industrial capacity exploited. Soviet military aid provided SA-2 missiles, but couldn't replace fired missiles at rates sufficient to sustain defense indefinitely. American aircraft production, ordnance supply, and spare parts availability allowed sustained operations at sortie rates that exhausted North Vietnamese defensive capacity. The war of attrition favored the side with greater industrial depth, and American industrial capacity vastly exceeded Soviet willingness to resupply North Vietnamese forces fighting what Moscow increasingly viewed as an unwinnable conflict. The psychological impact of 11 consecutive nights of bombing proved as important as physical destruction. North Vietnamese leadership had believed that American political constraints would prevent sustained strategic bombing. Each night that B-52s returned demonstrated that previous assumptions were wrong. The realization that American forces could continue operations indefinitely, could sustain losses that would have stopped earlier campaigns, and possessed industrial capacity to replace lost bombers faster than North Vietnam could rebuild, destroyed infrastructure, forced recalculation of strategic options. Continuing the war meant accepting destruction that would eventually exceed North Vietnam's capacity to recover. On January 8, 1973, North Vietnamese negotiators returned to Paris peace talks they had abandoned in May 1972. The timing was not coincidental. Linebacker II had ended on December 29th. Within 10 days, North Vietnamese leadership decided that continued military resistance was futile. Negotiations proceeded rapidly. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973, just 58 days after Linebacker II began. The agreement provided for American withdrawal from Vietnam, release of prisoners of war, and ceasefire that would theoretically allow South Vietnam to survive as independent state. The treaty's long-term effectiveness was questionable. North Vietnam would violate its terms and conquer South Vietnam in 1975, but Linebacker II had achieved its immediate objective of forcing negotiations and securing American withdrawal under conditions more favorable than unconditional retreat. The legacy of Linebacker II shaped American airpower doctrine for decades following Vietnam. The campaign demonstrated that strategic bombing remained viable despite sophisticated air defenses if executed with sufficient aircraft numbers, crew determination, and tactical flexibility. The 2% loss rate, 15 B-52s from 729 sorties, was acceptable for strategic objectives achieved. Higher loss rates during initial nights had been unsustainable, but tactical adaptation reduced losses to levels where operations could continue indefinitely. The campaign also validated theories about air defense saturation. North Vietnamese SA-2 systems were effective against limited numbers of targets following predictable patterns. When confronted with over 100 bombers approaching simultaneously from multiple directions with electronic warfare support and radar suppression, the defensive system collapsed under target overload. The lesson influenced subsequent American air campaign planning. Mass aircraft numbers, vary approach routes, employ comprehensive electronic warfare, and sustain operations long enough to exhaust enemy defensive resources. B-52 losses totaling 15 aircraft were significant in absolute terms, but represented small percentage of Strategic Air Command's bomber force. The crews lost, 93 men killed or captured, represented serious human cost, but didn't approach losses that would prevent continued operations. American willingness to accept those casualties and continue bombing signaled resolve that North Vietnamese leaders recognized. The political will to sustain strategic bombing, despite losses, differentiated Linebacker II from earlier operations, where casualty sensitivity had constrained American military action. North Vietnamese forces fired 1,200 SA-2 missiles during 11 days, an expenditure rate that proved unsustainable. The exhaustion of missile inventory was a critical factor in campaign success. Soviet resupply couldn't match depletion rates. North Vietnamese industrial base couldn't produce replacements domestically. Once missile stocks were depleted, air defense capacity collapsed, regardless of crew experience or tactical sophistication. The industrial dimension of strategic warfare, capacity to sustain operations and replace consumed ordnance, proved as important as technology or tactics. North Vietnamese post-war assessments acknowledged Linebacker II as decisive in forcing the 1973 peace settlement. While official propaganda minimized the campaign's impact for domestic consumption, internal military analyses recognized that continued defense against sustained strategic bombing was impossible with available resources. The campaign had achieved what years of tactical strikes during Rolling Thunder hadn't, convincing North Vietnamese leadership that military victory was unattainable and negotiated settlement was necessary. The B-52 Stratofortress continued service in conflicts following Vietnam, demonstrating the design's enduring utility. Gulf War operations in 1991 employed B-52s for carpet bombing of Iraqi Republican Guard positions and strategic strikes against infrastructure. Afghanistan operations beginning in 2001 used B-52s for close air support and interdiction missions. Iraq operations from 2003 through 2011 and Syria strikes from 2014 onward continued utilizing the bomber for precision strikes with modern weapons. The B-52H variant remains operational in 2025, representing over 70 years of service since the type's introduction in 1955. Current plans envision B-52 operations into the 2030s, with engine upgrades, avionics modernization, and integration of precision-guided joint direct attack munitions, transforming the Cold War-era bomber into relevant platform for 21st century warfare. Soviet military observers studied Linebacker II extensively, drawing conclusions about strategic bombing viability and air defense requirements. Soviet analysis recognized that sustained operations with sufficient aircraft numbers could overwhelm even sophisticated defenses. The campaign influenced Soviet investment in next-generation surface-to-air missile systems and integrated air defense networks designed to handle mass raids more effectively. The recognition that industrial capacity to sustain operations mattered as much as technology or tactics shaped Soviet doctrine through the remainder of the Cold War. The technological and tactical lessons of Linebacker II extended beyond Vietnam. American forces learned that electronic warfare and radar suppression were essential components of strategic bombing in defended airspace. Formation tactics that provided mutual support proved necessary when individual aircraft faced sophisticated missile threats. Tactical flexibility, adapting routes, altitudes, and timing based on enemy response, was critical to reducing losses. Industrial capacity to sustain operations, while replacing losses, determined strategic outcomes as much as technology or crew skill. North Vietnamese air defense had been built to stop 1960s tactical bombers. F-105 Thunderchiefs and F-4 Phantoms, flying predictable strike missions with limited electronic warfare support and minimal coordination. Operation Linebacker II brought strategic bombardment from 50,000 feet, with over 100 bombers per night arriving from multiple directions, protected by comprehensive jamming and radar suppression, sustained for 11 consecutive nights. North Vietnamese defenders fired 1,200 missiles and shot down 15 bombers, a tactical success that proved strategically insufficient. The gap wasn't SA-2 technology, which was effective when employed properly. The gap wasn't crew training, which had been honed through 8 years of combat experience. The gap was American capacity to sustain losses, adapt tactics, and return every night until enemy defensive resources were exhausted, and enemy leadership's will to resist was broken. Strategic bombing succeeded not through invulnerability to enemy defenses, but through determination to accept casualties necessary to achieve objectives and industrial capacity to replace losses faster than enemy forces could replenish defensive systems. 714 B-52 sorties that successfully struck targets, dropped 20,000 tons of bombs, and forced North Vietnamese leadership back to negotiations, represented victory achieved through attrition and endurance rather than technological invincibility. The bombers could be shot down. 15 losses proved that. But shooting down 15 bombers while 714 others completed their missions didn't prevent strategic defeat. North Vietnam had built formidable air defenses. They had trained competent crews. They had employed Soviet weapons effectively. But they faced an opponent willing to sustain operations until defensive capacity collapsed. And nothing in Soviet doctrine had prepared them for enemy determination, measured in 11 consecutive nights of bombing that wouldn't stop until North Vietnam surrendered.